My name is Lillian, and at 67, I found myself thrown out of my own son's birthday dinner. My daughter-in-law had waved over security, demanding they remove me as if I were some unwanted stranger. What she didn't realize was that the restaurant she sat in, the one she treated like her stage, belonged entirely to me. The following morning, with one swift signature, I reassigned her from assistant manager to dishwasher. It's remarkable how easily people decide your value from a pair of shoes, a worn purse strap, or the lines on your face, never suspecting that the quiet older woman they dismiss might be the one holding their paycheck and their future in her trembling hands. Standing there that night, humiliated before my family, I understood that preserving harmony had cost me too much. It was time to take back what I had allowed others to trample. Yet to understand how that dinner became the spark for everything that followed, we must return to where the first cracks began. Chloe entered our world like a storm wrapped in satin, graceful, dazzling, and far more dangerous than my son Jason could comprehend. When she first clasped my hand, her fingers limp and cool, I sensed instantly that she viewed me as an obstacle to overcome, not as family to respect. I wish I could pretend her cruelty surprised me later, but deep down, I always knew it was coming. What I refused to face was that Jason had chosen a woman who would one day strip me of dignity in front of everyone. Even the invitation to a celebration hadn't come from him, but through his assistant, written like an impersonal business memo, date, time, dress code, nothing else. No warmth, no affectionate note, not even a brief call to ask how I was. Still, I showed up because I am his mother, and that bond still mattered, no matter how much distance had grown between us. I arrived early, dressed in my nicest slacks and a silk blouse reserved for cherished occasions, its fabric still faintly perfumed with the scent my late husband adored. The hostess seemed uncertain where to seat me until I saw them come through the door. Jason walked in first, tall, poised, carrying that same quiet confidence his father once had, and beside him was Chloe, poured into a cream dress so snug it seemed to fight for air, her hair pinned high like she was modeling for a glossy magazine cover. They didn't see me at first, or perhaps chose not to, gliding past with rehearsed smiles and air kisses for their friends. I followed the hostess a few steps behind, silent, watching from the edge as if I were a ghost at my own son's celebration. The table already held 8 guests, though there were only 8 chairs. I waited, hoping Jason might notice, might pull over a seat, or that Chloe might at least offer a polite word, but she didn't. She gave me a single fleeting look, her eyes cold and assessing, before turning to the waiter with a smirk and saying, "Excuse me, there's someone loitering near our table." Then, as though discussing a misplaced coat, she added, "Could you please ask security to remove her? She must be lost." Her tone was effortless, cutting, and for a moment even I questioned whether I belonged there. A hush fell over the room. Glasses stilled. Waiters froze mid-motion. I could feel my pulse in my palms, not from shock or fury, but from something older and heavier, the quiet ache of a foundation giving way beneath years of restraint. Jason remained seated, eyes glued to his phone, pretending the screen was more interesting than his mother's humiliation. The young waiter, Miguel, who'd been with us nearly 2 years, looked to me for direction. I met his eyes and offered the faintest nod. "Go ahead, let her think she's victorious." I turned and left without a word, spine straight, refusing to gift them my pain. None of them realized that the restaurant itself was mine. Every linen, every shade on the wall, every staff member who had passed through my doors had done so under my care. 5 years earlier, when the old owner had gone under, I'd quietly bought Prima Lucia with the savings I'd built over decades, the same money I'd guarded after my husband's death, when all I had left were determination and a notebook filled with unspent dreams. And Chloe. She was on my payroll. She carried herself through that restaurant as though she were its rightful owner, issuing orders, nitpicking the servers, and making choices that were never hers to make. The manager, too easily swayed by her charm and polished smile, let her play pretend without consequence. But I wasn't fooled. I noticed the way she snapped at the waitstaff, the way her eyes rolled at anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision of status and success. That evening, I went home, turned off every light, and let the stillness wrap around me like armor. There were no tears, no shouting, only a quiet reckoning. I sat there and remembered the years that had shaped me, the endless nights scrubbing dishes to afford one more investment, the steady climb from nothing to ownership, the vow I made never to let anyone strip me of what I had rebuilt. By sunrise, I knew exactly what to do. One phone call was all it took. By noon, Chloe Hartman no longer appeared on the assistant manager roster, her new title, dishwasher, effective immediately. She would never see it coming, but the message would be unmistakable. She would feel it in every soapy plate she touched. That same night, while she curled beneath her satin sheets, dreaming of her imagined empire, I sat alone in my small kitchen. Wrapped in a worn flannel robe, I sipped weak tea from a chipped mug, the air humming softly with the refrigerator's low buzz. The overhead lamp threw long shadows across the faded linoleum, and for a moment, I just sat there, surrounded by the quiet remains of a life I had built and refused to let anyone diminish again. I wouldn't call it sadness, not exactly. It was heavier than that. A slow, dull ache that had been gathering inside me for years, born from watching my son drift further and further away, from realizing too late that in shielding him from every storm, I had made him forget who once stood between him and the wind. When my husband, James, passed 15 years ago, he took with him not only his laughter, but the construction business we had poured our lives into. He was kind and ambitious, but far too trusting. And when the market collapsed, it swallowed everything we'd built. Within half a year, the bank repossessed our trucks, our contracts disappeared, and the home where we'd raised Jason was no longer ours. We went from a modest house to a cramped rental, and then to something smaller still, until there was nothing left but a worn suitcase, a few keepsakes I couldn't bear to sell, and a heart stuffed with memories that had nowhere to go. Jason was already away at college on a full scholarship, blissfully unaware of how bad things had become. I told him I was managing. I always did, even as the truth hollowed me out. At night, I scrubbed office floors until my hands ached. By morning, I was behind the counter of a bakery, forcing a smile while my feet throbbed in my shoes. I learned to stretch a single dollar until it nearly broke, to turn down new clothes, small celebrations, and even warmth when the furnace went quiet. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that perseverance would eventually open a door, even though deep down, I knew the world rarely rewards those without the right name stitched on their sleeve. Still, I held on. I saved every spare coin, every tip, and stashed them in a small notebook I hid beneath my mattress, recording every number like a prayer. I stopped eating out, never took a vacation, never went to a movie. Every small denial was an investment in a future no one but me believed could still exist. I kept my head down and kept working, day after day, year after year, until one gray afternoon changed everything. I was walking home in the rain when I passed a shuttered Italian restaurant called Prima Lucia. Its windows were dark, doors chained, and a small handwritten sign announced its final closure. Something about that sight tugged at me. Maybe it reminded me of the little trattoria James had taken me to for our 10th anniversary, back when we still believed there was nothing we couldn't build. Or maybe it was the faint trace of garlic and rosemary lingering in the air, as if the walls themselves refused to surrender. That night, I opened the notebook that had lived under my mattress for years, the one filled with every penny I'd ever saved and every small dream I'd refused to let die. Page after page told the story of a decade of sacrifice. I was still short, painfully short, but for once I couldn't bring myself to close the book and let go, so I started knocking on doors, one bank after another. I leaned on the only currency I had, my reputation. The quiet woman who never missed a payment, who paid in cash, who smiled even when life didn't smile back. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A small local credit union agreed to take a chance. I signed the loan papers with trembling hands and walked out as the new owner of a failing restaurant I knew nothing about, except that it still had soul. And soul was something I understood. That first year nearly broke me. I slept in the cramped back office more nights than I'd ever admit. I learned how to tell fresh basil from dried, how to fold napkins into perfect swans, how to soothe angry diners, and how to bring a dead espresso machine back to life with nothing but a paper clip and a desperate prayer. I built my team, piece by piece, starting with Marcy, a young chef whose passion burned so bright it could light an empty kitchen. There was Leonard, the dishwasher who couldn't read a menu but could make every fork gleam like polished glass, and Dana, a single mother juggling 2 jobs who somehow still found the energy to keep the lunch rush smiling. Together, we brought Prima Lucia back to life, one plate, one laugh, one long night at a time. And I kept my secret. Not even Jason knew. When he came back from college wearing press suits that probably cost more than my old car, proud of his new position at a sleek accounting firm, I told him I was just helping out at a neighborhood diner. I didn't want him to feel burdened, or worse, to pity me. And somewhere deep down, I feared he might not care enough to ask. The calls became fewer, the visits shorter, and then came Chloe, beautiful, self-assured, and polished to perfection. The kind of woman who knew every rule of etiquette and used them like quiet weapons. She could make a compliment sound like an insult and smile while doing it. Once she praised my sweater, then asked if it was vintage, her tone dripping with the assumption that I couldn't possibly afford something new. I laughed it off, but I saw her eyes dart down to my shoes, the faint twitch of her nose whenever I mentioned working. In her gaze, I was something past its expiration date, and Jason, my own son, said nothing. When Chloe applied for a part-time hostess job at Prima Lucia, claiming she'd left a marketing position that didn't challenge her, she had no idea who signed her paychecks. I stayed behind the scenes, managing through others, my name nowhere visible. She walked in like she was saving the place from itself, charming the customers, dictating to the chefs, ordering the waitstaff around as if she'd been appointed commander of a sinking ship. I kept watching, week after week, studying every report, listening to the whispers from the staff. She belittled Miguel like he wasn't standing there. She mocked Marcy's accent under her breath. And when Leonard accidentally spilled water on himself during a busy night, she laughed, actually laughed, and called him clumsy when his back was turned. I didn't confront her, not yet. I wrote it all down, every slight, every sneer, every small cruelty. And then I waited. I kept hoping Jason would open his eyes, that he'd notice the small cruelties, the arrogance, the way Chloe treated people like furniture. But he didn't. His world revolved around promotions, quarterly bonuses, and the polished image of the woman beside him. He was too blinded by her shine to see the corrosion beneath it. So when they chose Prima Lucia for his birthday celebration, unaware that the deed carried my signature, I understood that the moment had finally come. I hadn't planned vengeance that night, only truth. And sometimes truth cuts deeper than revenge ever could, because it doesn't fade when the shouting stops. It lingers, echoing in the silence afterward. Chloe was about to learn that. There's a kind of cruel beauty in watching someone build their life on pretense, stacking layers of illusion until the weight of it all begins to collapse inward. That was Chloe in the days that followed the dinner, composed, smug, utterly certain she was untouchable. She acted as if the woman she'd humiliated, her husband's mother, had simply vanished, as if what she'd done could be erased with a swipe of lipstick or a new bottle of perfume. What she never realized was that I had been watching all along, not from across the dining room, but from the small office hidden behind the wine cellar, where the walls smelled faintly of oak and thyme. Every morning before opening, I'd sit with a chipped mug of coffee, reading through the night's reports, payroll records, incident logs, and customer feedback cards. Her name appeared often enough, complaints couched in polite phrases, how she snapped at the servers, how she joked inappropriately about the busboys, how she lectured the chef like a self-proclaimed critic who couldn't boil water without help. The manager, poor man, was too timid to challenge her, too worried about angering Jason, who would occasionally stop by for dinner, bringing Chloe flowers wrapped in paper that probably cost more than the wine she insisted on drinking. Though the staff remained outwardly polite, I could sense the unrest simmering beneath their smiles. It revealed itself in clipped tones, in laughter that didn't quite reach their eyes, in the glances they shared whenever Chloe strutted through the kitchen in heels meant for a runway, not a restaurant. Marcy, who had poured her heart into rebuilding the menu and mentoring every new hire, quietly began asking for fewer shifts. Dana, once the heartbeat of the lunch crowd, grew subdued, her laughter rare and fleeting. Even Leonard, sweet, steady Leonard, had started taking his breaks outside, preferring the company of traffic and cigarette smoke to the humiliation of being ridiculed for spilled coffee or a clumsy step. I watched it unfold slowly, like a sweater unraveling thread by thread, powerless to stop it but unwilling to intervene. Not yet. Chloe's cruelty wasn't confined to how she treated people. It infected everything around her. She treated Prima Lucia as her own private stage, parading through the dining room during rush hours, interrupting servers mid-order to flaunt her authority, correcting hostesses on their posture, even offering fashion advice to girls young enough to be her interns. She would prattle on about her eye for refinement and natural leadership, completely oblivious to how ridiculous she sounded. It might have been funny if it hadn't been so poisonous. She couldn't grasp that the soul of Prima Lucia wasn't in the chandeliers or the imported china. It was in the people who showed up before dawn, stayed until the last light went out, and cleaned until their backs ached, proud to call this place theirs. But I stayed silent. I let her arrogance bloom. I kept the weak manager in place even when I could have dismissed him, because I needed Chloe to reveal herself completely. I wanted her mask to slip on its own, for everyone to see the person she truly was. And when the fractures began to show, I knew the breaking point would come soon. It arrived on a gray Tuesday. Miguel came into my office pale and shaking, clutching a note Chloe had written in her neat, self-satisfied script. In it, she accused him of stealing tips and demanded that he be fired immediately. My heart tightened, because I knew Miguel, and I knew what kind of woman would write something like that. Miguel had been part of Prima Lucia for almost 3 years, steady, kind, and always the first to arrive. Not once had he missed a shift. Every month, without fail, he sent part of his paycheck to his grandmother in El Paso. I didn't need to ask questions or review footage. I already knew Chloe's accusation was nothing but a lie. It reeked of calculation. An attempt to clear a path for her cousin, who'd been loitering around the host stand for weeks, waiting for an opening. I told Miguel to take the rest of the day off, reassured him that everything would be fine, and when he left, I sat there staring at that folded note for what felt like an eternity. My hand rested on it as though I could drain the poison right through my skin. This wasn't mere disrespect anymore. It was deliberate cruelty. That night, long after everyone had gone, I walked the restaurant alone. The lights were dim. The air smelled faintly of lemon and old wood polish. I moved from table to table, trailing my fingertips along the smooth surfaces I'd once scrubbed by hand. I remembered the nights I mopped these very floors until my knees throbbed. The evenings James balanced the books by candlelight when the power went out. the quiet triumph of finally making this place stand on its own again. Brick by brick, hour by hour, I had rebuilt Prima Lucia out of sweat, patience, and silence, and I refused to let a woman like Chloe stain it simply because no one had ever taught her compassion. She thought she existed above accountability. That charm could mask cruelty forever. But the higher you climb on the backs of others, the harder the fall when they finally move aside. I didn't close my eyes that night. I didn't need to. The choice was already made. By dawn, the gears were turning. What awaited Chloe wasn't fury or spectacle. It was something quieter and far more lasting. She would come to understand what it meant to be invisible, to feel herself fade into the background of a place she had once tried to command, and she would learn that lesson standing in the very back room she had always ignored. That morning didn't feel like a grand beginning. It felt calm, final. The morning carried an almost fragile stillness, the low hum of cars outside, the faint aroma of fresh coffee curling through the air. As I sat alone in the back office of the restaurant I had built with my own 2 hands and more years of sacrifice than I could count. In front of me lay the papers I'd prepared the night before. Chloe's demotion notice, her name printed neatly at the top, the updated schedule assigning her 5 evening shifts in the dishwashing rotation, and the official file citing performance and conduct concerns. Nothing vindictive, nothing exaggerated, just the truth, finally written down for everyone to see. I sipped my coffee slowly, studying the sealed envelope resting on the edge of the desk. By the end of the day, it would be waiting for her on the manager's table. For a moment, I considered stepping aside, letting it all unfold without me. No confrontation, no scene, just quiet consequence. But I knew better. Someone like Chloe wouldn't go quietly. Pride never does. I lingered longer than I meant to, sorting invoices, rearranging files, letting the minutes drag out like slow raindrops. Then I heard her, that unmistakable sharpness in her voice cutting through the hallway. The tone was clipped and venomous, blaming someone for a misplaced reservation, berating the front staff, tossing accusations like shards of glass. Her heels struck the floor harder with each step, the rhythm of anger drawing closer until it stopped just beyond the door. Then it burst open, rattling the frame. She stood there, framed in the doorway, her perfectly styled hair beginning to frizz in the thick summer air, her face flushed and eyes rimmed red from rage. In her hand was the printed schedule, crumpled from her grip. She stormed in mid-sentence, too consumed by fury to notice who sat behind the desk. But when her gaze finally met mine, the words died in her throat. Something flickered across her face. Not indignation, not even surprise, but fear. Pure, unguarded fear. The kind that blooms when the ground shifts under your feet and you realize the person you've been looking down on has been standing above you all along. I didn't speak. I didn't flinch. I simply held her gaze and let the silence expand between us until it filled the room like air after a storm, steady and absolute. I could see the change ripple through her. The shallow breath, the tightness in her shoulders, the faint tremor in the hand gripping that crumpled schedule. For a second, I thought she might erupt, that the fury she'd been nursing for so long would finally spill out in a burst of words or a slammed door. I half expected the folder to go flying across the room, for her to unleash the chaos she carried like perfume. But then something shifted. From the front of the restaurant came a sharp crash. The unmistakable shatter of glass, sudden and loud like a warning bell splitting the air. One of the busboys had dropped an entire tray of dishes. The noise jolted Chloe. She flinched hard, the sound cutting through her rage like cold water. She blinked, looked down at the paper in her hand, and in that instant, whatever fight she'd been gathering simply evaporated. Without a word, she stepped back, turned on her heel, and walked out. Her once commanding stride had changed, quicker now, uncertain, stripped of the confidence she'd wrapped herself in. I sat there, in complete stillness, listening to her footsteps fade down the hall, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace. Not because I'd won, but because I hadn't had to fight. I'd refused to meet her in the dirt she called home. She'd been ready to destroy something, and I'd simply refused to let that something be me. Later that day, as I made my usual rounds through the restaurant, I noticed how different the air felt. The kitchen buzzed with quiet focus instead of tension. The servers were laughing again. Real laughter this time. Their shoulders relaxed, their movements lighter. Miguel caught my eye and gave me a small nod, the kind that carries more gratitude than words ever could. Dana smiled from the hostess stand, her posture easy again. Even Marcy, ever consumed by her work, looked up from the stove and offered a brief, knowing glance. No one asked questions. They didn't need to. People always sense when a weight has been lifted. That evening, after everyone had gone, I lingered. The lights were dim, the chairs turned upside down on the tables, the soft scent of lemon and wine lingering in the air. I walked the length of the dining room slowly, tracing my hand across the edges of the tables I once scrubbed myself. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, steady, sacred. And as I stood there, surrounded by what I had built from the ground up, I felt neither bitterness nor victory, just quiet strength, the kind that comes from surviving what was meant to break you and choosing, over and over again, to stand anyway. I felt composed, grounded, and certain of what needed to happen, because by the next morning, Chloe would be standing in the kitchen where she truly belonged, apron tied, mop in hand, finally learning what it meant to earn respect instead of demand it. At precisely 8 o'clock, the back door swung open. She stepped inside stiffly, her shoulders squared like armor, lips pressed so tight they'd lost their color. Behind oversized sunglasses, she tried to conceal eyes that had already seen too much. Dressed in a sleek black blouse and polished leather flats, she looked absurdly out of place among the clatter of pans and the smell of soap, still clinging to the fading illusion of status that was slipping away like perfume washed off in the rain. Her new apron waited for her, neatly folded on the metal shelf beside a clipboard of cleaning assignments and a checklist for opening tasks. It wasn't a punishment, it was procedure. Everyone on dish duty received the same. Fairness, after all, only feels cruel to those unaccustomed to it. If she wanted to call it injustice, she'd have to admit she never believed in equality to begin with. I didn't hover, I didn't smirk. I simply stayed by the sink, marking inventory sheets, letting the quiet weight of authority settle over the room. It's strange how silence can command more than shouting ever will. Chloe said nothing, but her body spoke volumes. Her fingers shook as she picked up the rag. Her manicured nails scraped against the stainless steel as she wiped the counters, the motion uncertain and graceless. Bit by bit, I could see it dawn on her. No one was coming to save her. No sudden apology from management, no call from Jason, no reversal of fate. She straightened her back, tried to compose herself, but I saw the cracks. Dana passed by carrying 2 heavy trays, and Chloe averted her eyes. Miguel handed her a bin of silverware without so much as a glance. Each small dismissal chipped at her pride. I watched as a drop of soapy water splashed onto her designer blouse, and her jaw tightened, her gaze flicking toward the exit like a trapped animal searching for an escape that wasn't there. And it was only the first hour. By noon, her once sleek hair clung to her temples, the humidity turning it limp and damp. Her sleeves were rolled haphazardly to her elbows, and her polished shoes were streaked with water and soap. I had done this very work once, for years, when my back ached and my hands cracked, when no one noticed or thanked me, when survival depended on showing up no matter how hard it was. Watching Chloe now, bent over the same counters I had scrubbed through my grief, through exhaustion, I didn't feel triumphant, not angry, not proud, just a calm, deep stillness, the kind that comes when a long chapter finally closes on its own. She was living a truth I'd known all my life, one she had spent years pretending didn't exist. But the day wasn't over. Not yet. I had one last thing in motion. Nothing cruel, just intentional. A mirror held quietly to her pride. That evening, a private family dinner was booked in the small dining room. Jason's event, planned weeks earlier. He hadn't canceled after the birthday debacle, hadn't even thought to. The reservation stood, 12 guests, a fixed menu, wine pairings. The manager had his email printed neatly on the clipboard, the tone brisk and impersonal. I knew what he assumed, that I would stay away, keep my distance, let things smooth over as mothers often do, but I had no intention of disappearing again. I made sure the table was set to perfection. Fresh linens, polished glasses, candles flickering low. The menu was prepared exactly as ordered, and I didn't have to lift a finger beyond that because Chloe's schedule handled the rest. She was on duty. And in Prima Lucia, when you're on the schedule, you serve. There was something quietly poetic about the moment. Chloe, carrying a tray into that private room, serving bread to the same people who had once watched her dismiss me like a stranger. Her chin was lifted, her smile brittle, her hands trembling just enough for me to see the strain. She poured wine carefully, nodded when spoken to, tried to pretend the air around her wasn't thick with memory. Jason avoided my eyes, focused instead on his phone, his face tight with discomfort he didn't quite know how to name. She never looked at me, not directly, but I saw her fingers tighten around the tray's handle, the smallest tremor in her wrist each time she reached for a glass. Her movements had lost their ease. They were stiff now, cautious, every motion a fragile performance for an audience that had already moved on. And the staff? They said nothing. No whispers, no smirks, no glances exchanged behind her back. They simply worked, steady, polite, indifferent. They treated her the way she had once treated them, as though she were invisible, another uniform in a crowded kitchen trying to make it through the shift. At one point during the dinner, a fork slipped from Chloe's hand and hit the tile with a sharp, ringing clang that sliced through the chatter and stilled the room for an instant. Jason glanced up from his phone but didn't move, didn't say a word. Someone cleared their throat to fill the silence. Chloe crouched down, gathered the fallen utensil, and walked quickly back to the kitchen, her eyes fixed on the floor. I stayed silent. I didn't need to speak. The sound of that fork had already said everything. When the evening came to a close and the guests began to rise from their seats, I remained where I was, sitting at the head of the table with my cup of tea. The candles had burned low, their wax pooling into soft shapes, the air thick with the quiet after an unspoken reckoning. Chloe stepped back into the room, drying her hands on a towel. Her face was pale, expressionless, not furious, not proud, simply hollow. A kind of emptiness I recognized from my own years of rebuilding, the kind that arrives only after the truth has stripped you clean. She didn't say anything. She didn't look at me. But I knew she felt it. The weight of that night, the knowledge that no position, no outfit, no ring on her finger could shield her from accountability. She had finally met herself without the armor. For the first time since that awful birthday dinner, something inside me quieted. It wasn't joy or revenge or vindication. It was peace. The kind that comes when you stop begging for respect from those incapable of giving it. In the days that followed, the restaurant found a new rhythm. The tension that had once clung to the walls seemed to ease. Conversations flowed again, lighter, freer. Laughter returned to the corners of the kitchen. Chloe still showed up, punctual and composed, her smile strained and her shoulders stiff, but it was obvious. Something inside her had gone dim, not from the labor itself, but from the sudden loss of control, the collapse of the illusion that she was above consequence. She no longer barked orders or hovered over the hostess stand pretending to lead. She simply clocked in, did the work, and left quietly at the end of each shift. And sometimes, as I passed through the prep area, I'd catch her pausing before the glass of the window, staring at her reflection, at the version of herself stripped of jewels, stripped of attention, stripped of power, trying to understand who she had become. She spent her days quietly now, washing dishes, wiping down counters, moving through the kitchen with the small, careful steps of someone who had finally been humbled enough to feel the world pressing close around her. Yet even as the noise of her arrogance faded, a different kind of silence began to echo in my life. Jason's. He kept his distance. The calls I made went unanswered. The one lunch I tried to arrange was canceled with a polite excuse. His absence hurt in ways I didn't admit to anyone. There's a particular kind of pain in being erased gently, not through words or conflict, but through the slow erosion of attention, until you start to wonder if you were ever truly seen at all. I had always promised myself I wouldn't make him choose between us, but over time, I realized the choice had already been made. It wasn't spoken, but it lived in every empty seat where he should have been, every family gathering I wasn't invited to, every card that never arrived on my birthday. I told myself I could accept it, that I didn't need his approval, that independence was its own kind of peace. Still, a quiet part of me held on to hope, that someday he'd open his eyes and see who she really was, that he'd remember the woman who'd raised him, who'd kept the heat running through the coldest winters, who'd gone without so he could have enough. That fragile hope shattered one morning when he appeared at the restaurant without warning. He looked sharp, polished, the kind of man success had molded, standing in the doorway of my office like a stranger I once knew. The expression on his face told me everything before he said a word. He set a stack of documents on my desk, the paper crisp and heavy, his tone formal. He reminded me of a power of attorney form I'd signed years earlier, a precaution back when I was preparing for minor surgery, when he was still in college, when I trusted him with everything I owned. I hadn't thought of it in years, and in that moment, with that calm, practiced voice, he told me he was selling Prima Lucia. I wouldn't be managing it anymore. I would receive a payout. My name, he said, would be removed from the business records, as if it had never been there at all. Chloe will handle the staff transition, he said, his tone clipped and professional, as if he were discussing a quarterly report rather than dismantling my life's work. We're moving out of state. It's already finalized, and just like that, it was done. For a moment, the world went soundless. The steady hum of the refrigerator faded. The air itself felt heavy and far away. I couldn't feel my hands on the desk. I could only stare at the documents, at the clean, confident signatures that marked the end of everything I had built. And then at the man standing before me, the same one I had carried through sickness and hunger, the one I had believed would never forget where he came from. He didn't wait for me to speak, didn't offer explanation or regret. He simply turned and left, his polished shoes clicking down the hallway until the sound disappeared. And in that instant, it wasn't a stranger who had taken what was mine. It was family. The very two people who had once stripped me of dignity in public now walked away owning the dream I had rebuilt from ashes. But life, I've learned, moves on quiet, unseen gears. When everything looks lost, something small and unexpected often begins to shift in the background. That evening, I sat on the porch, the sun slipping low, the air still, the ache inside me too deep for words. I almost let the restaurant's call roll to voicemail, but something made me answer. It was Miguel. His voice trembled, but his words were clear. He'd seen documents Chloe had brought in, files she claimed were for the transition, but the timestamps didn't match. Some of the signatures looked copied. Others had been printed from off-site accounts. He'd noticed small sums missing from petty cash, amounts too specific to be accidents. At first, he'd blamed the accounting software, but now he was certain. Chloe had been siphoning money for months, long before the demotion, using false invoices and quiet transfers that no one else had caught. Jason, he said, had no idea. I told Miguel to send every file to my attorney immediately. Then I stayed on the phone, listening as he went through the numbers one by one, each discrepancy cutting deeper than the last. Every dollar a trace of betrayal written in ink. I froze the sale. Within hours, I invoked the fraud protection clauses tied to my original ownership, reactivating my rights and halting every transaction in progress. The documents Miguel sent became evidence. Timestamps, bank trails, forged signatures, all of it submitted to the State Business Board and the Tax Compliance Division. By the next morning, Chloe's name was stricken from every record, her access revoked, her position officially terminated, pending investigation. And Jason, he finally called, not to defend her, not to demand an explanation, just a quiet question. How long had I known? Long enough, I said. Then I ended the call. He came in a few days later, not in the sharp confidence he used to wear like armor, but subdued, smaller somehow. He said he hadn't known, that he hadn't seen it coming, that he'd trusted her. I believed him. But I didn't respond, not out of spite. I was simply done bleeding words for someone who hadn't listened the first 100 times. Some wounds, I've learned, don't need to be mended. They just need space to close on their own. He left quietly, not expecting forgiveness. Maybe one day I'll find it in me to offer it, but not yet. Now Prima Lucia is mine again, fully, legally, and without fanfare. The staff knows what happened, though no one ever mentions it. The kitchen feels lighter. The laughter sounds real again. Every morning I sit at my desk with a cup of coffee, sunlight spilling through the front windows, and I understand something I never truly grasped before. Dignity isn't given. It's reclaimed. It's the quiet, unshakable strength you hold when you stop begging to be seen and start standing on your own terms. And if you're hearing this, I'll ask you one thing. Have you ever been treated like you were nothing by someone who didn't realize you were everything? If you have, tell me. What did you do next?